Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a piece of proposed U.S. legislation that could have some absolutely enormous consequences for finance, technology, you name it.
So let's start with a wild question. What if the US government actually wanted you to pay them in Bitcoin? It sounds a little out there, right? But it's the core idea behind a very real bill that's been proposed in Congress called the Bitcoin for America Act.
Okay, so let's get into what this thing actually is. This bill isn't just some minor tweak to the tax code. No. We're talking about a proposal that would fundamentally shift how the U.S. government sees and handles digital assets altogether.
At its heart, this proposal is built on two pretty radical ideas. And these ideas, well, they could set off a massive chain reaction.
So here's the nuts and bolts of how it would work. First, you could pay your federal taxes directly with Bitcoin. But get this, to encourage you to do it, the government would waive the capital gains taxes on the Bitcoin you use. And here's the real kicker. The government wouldn't sell that Bitcoin for dollars. It would be required to hold on to it, putting it into a permanent strategic reserve.
Right? And that commitment, that promise to hold, is what creates the very first major ripple effect. It completely changes the role of some key government agencies.
I mean, just think about what this pipeline would mean in practice. The IRS and the Treasury would have to build a whole new system to securely hold and manage a digital asset at a national scale. We're talking about a complete operational overhaul for them.
And this chart really nails the paradigm shift. You'd go from the old way, right? Taxes are paid in dollars, and the government immediately spends those dollars. But in the proposed new way, taxes can be paid in Bitcoin, and the government holds it. It's a fundamental move away from a pure fiat-based system to one that's integrated with a digital asset.
This all leads to a really striking way of looking at it from the source material. The bill would effectively turn the IRS into an involuntary Bitcoin accumulation desk for the U.S. government. Just imagine that. The taxman just stacking sats day in and day out.
Okay, so that's the first ripple. Now let's talk about the second one, because this is where things could spread to the private sector in a big way. We're talking about a green light for corporations.
The logic here is pretty simple. If the U.S. government itself decides that Bitcoin is good enough to put on its own balance sheet, well, that sends a massive signal of credibility to all of corporate America.
And just look at the potential impacts. All of a sudden, holding Bitcoin goes from being a really bold, kind of risky strategy to one that's federally validated. For a CFO, that perceived career risk of buying Bitcoin just melts away. In fact, you might see the script flip, where there's competitive pressure to acquire Bitcoin just to keep up. It could totally change the game.
Now this brings us to the third ripple effect, and honestly, this might be the most significant one of all. We're talking about global game theory. Because think about it, if the United States, the world's biggest economy, starts treating Bitcoin like a strategic reserve asset, kind of like digital gold, then, according to the source material, every other country on the planet is immediately forced to make a very critical choice.
And it's a huge geopolitical dilemma. Do you jump in the race and start buying up Bitcoin now, competing directly with the US for an asset that's famously limited in supply? Or do you just ignore it and risk being completely left behind if a new financial order starts to take shape around it?
This kind of international race could trigger what economists call a supply shock. I mean, if you have multiple governments all scrambling to buy up an asset with a fixed supply, it's going to pull a huge amount of Bitcoin off the open market, making what's left even more scarce.
So what happens when you put all these ripples together? When they all combine? Well, we could be looking at the dawn of a whole new financial era. And at the absolute heart of all this game theory, all this competition, is this one simple number: 21 million. That's it. That is the total number of Bitcoin that can ever exist. And that absolute hard-coded scarcity is precisely what makes the idea of governments accumulating it so incredibly powerful.
So, you see, this is so much bigger than just a new way to pay taxes. What this bill really represents is a potential watershed moment. It could be the very first time the U.S. government officially recognizes Bitcoin not just as money, but as a strategic national asset. That is a massive philosophical leap.
So, the big question is this the bill that finally pushes Bitcoin from the fringes into the very center of global finance? You know, we don't know if it'll become law, but in a way, it almost doesn't matter. The proposal itself has already changed the conversation, and it leaves us all with a critical question about the future of money itself.